Hello, everyone. Have you ever been on a plane landing at Harry Reid International, looked out the window at the endless expanse of concrete and asphalt, and felt a strange, almost imperceptible vibration? A low hum that sinks right into your bones? Tell me if you have. Because I believe it's more than just the engines. I was a civil engineer for most of my life. A concrete man, you could say. I specialized in large-scale infrastructure projects, dams, bridges, and eventually airports. In the late 1990s, I was a project supervisor on the expansion of what was then called McCarran International. It was a massive undertaking, a sprawling ballet of earth movers, cement mixers, and sun-beaten crews working under the relentless Nevada sun. Vegas was booming, and the airport needed to grow with it. We were laying down new taxiways and a brand new runway, 1Rs 19L, on the west side of the facility. It was a standard job, or so I thought. The plans were thick, the specifications exacting. We were pouring millions of cubic yards of Portland cement concrete, PCC, engineered to withstand the repeated brutal impact of a fully loaded 747. I knew the specs by heart, the required slump, the aggregate composition, the curing times. It was my world. The anomaly began subtly. A section of the planned runway about a third of the way from the southern threshold was designated as a special engineering zone in a late-stage addendum to the blueprints. This wasn't unusual in itself. Sometimes you hit a patch of poor soil, a caliche deposit that needs special treatment. But this was different. The revised plans came not from our primary contractors or the Clark County Department of Aviation, but were delivered by courier directly from a nondescript office in North Las Vegas, an office that, after a little digging, I found was leased by a shell corporation with ties to the Department of Energy. The men who came with the plans were not engineers in my sense of the word. They wore suits, even in the blistering heat, and carried themselves with the quiet, unnerving confidence of federal agents. They introduced themselves as consultants, there to oversee a critical substrate stabilization project. Their leader, a man I only ever knew as Mr. Black, had eyes that seemed to analyze the stress points in your character rather than the soil reports. He explained, in a voice devoid of any warmth, that the geology in this specific sector was uniquely unstable and required a proprietary solution. They cordoned off a massive rectangular area, roughly 200 feet wide and 600 feet long. The security was immediate and absolute. Our regular survey crews were dismissed from that section, replaced by a tight-lipped team with unusual equipment I'd never seen before. Devices that looked more like something you'd see at the Nevada test site than on a commercial construction project. They took gravimetric readings, magnetic resonance scans, and something they called subsonic harmonic profiling. The results of these surveys were never shared with my team. We were simply instructed to excavate the area to a depth of 50 feet, far deeper than any runway foundation required. The earth that came out of that pit was strange. It wasn't the usual mix of sand and clay. Deeper down, it became a dark, almost greasy soil that clung to the excavator buckets and seemed to absorb the light. The crews complained about it. They said it had a weird, metallic smell like ozone after a lightning strike. Several of my best operators reported persistent headaches and a feeling of profound unease when working in the pit. One of them, a hardened veteran named Gus, quit on the spot, telling me the place was wrong and that he could hear a low hum coming from the ground, a sound that followed him home at night. I dismissed it as heat exhaustion and nerves, but I made a note of it. The consultants from the DOE watched every truckload of soil as it was hauled away, not to a standard landfill, but to a secure facility out near Henderson, each truck followed by a black sedan. They were treating dirt like it was classified material. This wasn't a soil stabilization project. This was a burial. And we were digging the grave. But we had no idea what we were burying or what was already down there, waiting. We were just the grunts, paid to move dirt and pour concrete and to ask no questions. But I've never been good at that. That low hum Gus mentioned, I started hearing it too. The pit was a gaping wound in the desert floor, a perfect sharp-edged rectangle that seemed to defy the natural slope of the land. Once we hit the 50-foot mark, our excavation work was done. Mr. Black and his team took over the site completely. They erected a temporary windowless structure over the entire area, a massive tent of thick, opaque black material that blocked both the sun and prying eyes. The hum became more noticeable now, even from the perimeter fence they'd erected. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears so much as you felt it in your teeth and sternum, a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to sync up with your own pulse. My crew and I were officially reassigned to other parts of the expansion, but my curiosity and a growing sense of professional indignation kept pulling me back. I had a right to know what was going on in the middle of my project site. My colleague, a geotech engineer named Dave Jensen, was even more obsessed. Dave was brilliant, a guy who could tell you the load-bearing capacity of a rock just by looking at it. He was fascinated by the DOE team's secretive surveys and convinced they'd found something unprecedented. He started taking his own readings from the edge of the cordoned-off zone at night, using a portable seismograph and a spectrum analyzer he'd borrowed from the university lab where his wife worked. The data he collected was bizarre. He showed me the printouts in the flickering light of his truck's dashboard. There was a persistent, ultra-low frequency signature emanating from the pit, a clean, almost artificial sine wave at around 16 hertz. It wasn't seismic noise. It was too steady, too pure. "That's not natural geology, Frank," he'd said, his eyes wide. "That's a machine. Or something pretending to be one." He also found strange magnetic field fluctuations, powerful and erratic. One night, under the excuse of checking on our dewatering pumps, I managed to get a glimpse inside the black tent. A security guard was distracted and a flap was left partially open. What I saw burned itself into my memory. The bottom of the pit wasn't being filled with gravel or flowable fill. It was being lined with something I couldn't identify. Large, interlocking panels of a matte black material that looked like a cross between ceramic and obsidian were being meticulously lowered into place by a specialized crane. They fit together perfectly, with no mortar or grout. Wires, thick as my wrist and sheathed in a dull gray insulation, snaked between the panels, converging on a central bus-sized object that was half buried in the center of the pit floor. It wasn't a machine in any conventional sense. It had no moving parts, no vents, no seams. It was a solid, featureless mass of the same dark, non-reflective material, and the hum seemed to emanate directly from it. The DOE consultants moved around it in full-body hazardous environment suits, the kind you see in movies about viral outbreaks. They weren't protecting themselves from dust. They were protecting themselves from the pit itself. That's when the real fear began to set in. Dave and I started compiling a private file, a collection of his readings, my observations, and photographs we'd taken with a long-lens camera from a nearby terminal building. We were engineers, men of science, and measurable facts. We believed that if we gathered enough data, we could make sense of it. We were wrong. The effects on the personnel working close to the site were getting worse. It wasn't just headaches anymore. People became irritable, forgetful. Fights broke out over minor issues. 2 foremen, both calm, experienced professionals, had to be pulled apart after a screaming match over a rebar schedule. Dave himself began to change. He grew gaunt, his eyes were always bloodshot, and he started complaining that the hum never stopped, even when he was miles away at home. He said he was having nightmares, waking visions of fractured geometry and colors that don't exist. His wife was scared. I was scared. He was getting too close to whatever that thing in the pit was, and it was breaking him down from the inside out. The point of no return came on a Tuesday. Dave called me, his voice a frantic whisper. "I got a sample, Frank. I got a goddamn sample." He'd bribed one of the night shift security guards, a kid who was more interested in his magazine than his post. While the DOE crew was on a shift change, Dave had slipped under the tent, chipped off a small piece of one of the black ceramic panels with a geology hammer, and gotten out. He was ecstatic, convinced this was the proof we needed to expose the whole operation. I felt a cold dread wash over me. This was no longer a professional curiosity. It was a federal crime. I met him in a dusty, forgotten corner of a long-term parking garage. He held the sample in a lead-lined pouch he used for radioactive rock samples. Even through the shielding, I felt it. The hum. It was concentrated now, a malevolent little pulse of energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The sample itself was heavier than it looked, unnaturally dense. It was cool to the touch, and the surface seemed to drink the light, a perfect, starless black. "This stuff isn't on the periodic table," Dave breathed, his hands trembling. "The specific gravity is all wrong. It's some kind of composite. A ceramic matrix with a suspended metallic lattice. Crystalline. But the structure, it's impossible. It's like it's folded in on itself in extra dimensions." He was rambling, his scientific mind trying to process something that defied his understanding. That was the last time I saw him as the man I knew. 2 days later, Mr. Black and 2 of his silent associates intercepted me as I was leaving the main site office. There was no preamble. "Your colleague, Mr. Jensen, has been reassigned," Black said, his voice flat and cold as a slab of granite. "His work here is concluded. So is your unauthorized interest in our project. You're a good engineer, Mr. Peterson. You build things that last. I suggest you focus on that." He looked me directly in the eye, and for a moment, I felt that same disorienting pressure from the pit, a mental squeeze that made my thoughts scatter. "There are some things that are meant to stay buried," he continued, "for the good of everyone. If you continue your extracurricular research, your career will be the least of your concerns. The file you and Mr. Jensen have been compiling, destroy it. Forget everything you've seen and everything you think you know." This conversation never happened. They didn't threaten my life, not in so many words. They didn't have to. The threat was absolute. I went home and called Dave's number. It was disconnected. I called his wife. She was sobbing, saying only that some men from the government had come and taken him away for a medical emergency. He was gone. The next day, the real burial began. A fleet of concrete trucks, far more than were scheduled for any other part of the project, began arriving at the cordoned-off zone. They weren't from our usual suppliers. These were unmarked vehicles with federal plates. For 72 hours straight, they poured. It wasn't standard PCC. My contacts at the batch plant, plied with a bottle of good whiskey, told me the mix was unlike anything they'd ever seen. It was loaded with lead shavings, barium sulfate, and a strange, fibrous polymer. It was a shielding material designed to contain immense amounts of energy. They filled the entire 50-foot pit with this exotic concrete, entombing the black panels, the strange wiring, and the featureless, humming object at its heart. They built a sarcophagus. Then on top of that, they layered more specialized materials, thick sheets of a polymer I didn't recognize, a mesh of what looked like copper, and finally, the runway itself. A 20-inch slab of the toughest PCC known to man. When they were done, it looked like any other runway. Smooth, gray, and perfectly featureless. The hum was gone. But I knew what was under there. I had a copy of Dave's data hidden away. I had my own notes. I couldn't destroy them. I owed him that much. The project was completed. The runway was commissioned, and planes began to land and take off, their 1,000-ton weights pressing down day after day on the secret we had sealed. Life moved on, as it does. The Las Vegas skyline grew more audacious, the casinos more extravagant. I finished the McCarran project and moved on to others, building highways in Arizona, retrofitting bridges in California. I tried to bury the memory of the pit, of Mr. Black's dead eyes, of Dave's frantic voice. I tried to convince myself it was just a strange but ultimately forgettable chapter in a long career. But it was always there, a low-frequency hum in the back of my mind. I never heard from Dave again. His wife, after a few tearful, fruitless phone calls, moved back to Ohio to be with her family. She was told he'd had a severe and sudden psychotic break and was in a long-term federal medical facility from which he could not be contacted. His official employment record was wiped clean. It was as if he had never been a part of the project, as if he had never existed. The silence was more terrifying than any threat. Around 2005, I took an early retirement. I had made enough money, and the fire in my belly for pouring concrete had gone out. It had been replaced by a cold, persistent obsession. I moved into a small house in Henderson, and I began my real work. I became a digital ghost, a frequenter of obscure government archives, a student of declassified documents. I spent thousands of hours sifting through the digital and physical refuse of the Cold War, searching for a ghost project that matched what I had seen. The keywords were my mantra: geological resonance, subsonic influence, non-lethal area denial, bioempathetic frequencies. Most of the documents were useless, vast oceans of blacked-out text. But occasionally, a word, a phrase, a redacted project number would surface, a tiny island in the sea of official secrecy. I learned about projects aimed at using infrasound to induce fear or nausea in enemy troops. I read about attempts to weaponize the Earth's natural magnetic field. Much of it was theoretical, dead-end research. But then, I found it. A footnote in a heavily redacted 1970s report from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. It mentioned a highly classified initiative operating out of the Nevada test site, codenamed Project Chimera. The project's mandate was to investigate and potentially weaponize unique resonant geologic formations. The theory, as pieced together from the few unredacted sentences, was that certain deep earth crystalline structures could be stimulated to emit powerful, coherent, low-frequency waves. These waves, being below the range of human hearing, would bypass the ears and directly affect the human brain, specifically the vestibular system and the hippocampus. The potential applications were staggering. inducing vertigo and disorientation, disrupting memory formation, even creating vivid, targeted hallucinations. It was the ultimate psychological weapon. The report mentioned a primary test site where a significant natural anomaly had been identified. The location was classified, but the geological markers it described, a unique confluence of igneous and metamorphic rock at a specific depth, matched the known geology under the Las Vegas Valley. The project was officially terminated in 1982. The reason given was uncontrollable and hazardous biofeedback loops. In layman's terms, they had created something they couldn't turn off and couldn't control. The thing they were studying started studying them back. The feedback loop caused rapid psychological degradation in research personnel. Paranoia, schizophrenia, temporal lobe epilepsy. The same symptoms that had afflicted my crew and that had consumed Dave. They hadn't been building a machine in that pit. They had found something. A naturally occurring engine of immense power. The black panels, the wiring, that wasn't the device. That was the containment system. They had tried to study it, failed, and in their terror, they had decided to bury it, to put a lid on Pandora's box. And the perfect place to build a permanent, monitored, high-security tomb was under the one place in the desert that was constantly being rebuilt and expanded, the airport. The pieces began to lock into place, forming a picture more disturbing than I could have imagined. Project Chimera wasn't just shut down, it was buried alive. The uniquely unstable geology Mr. Black had mentioned wasn't a risk to the Runway's foundation. It was a risk to the sanity of every living thing in a multi-mile radius. I needed more than just a footnote in a redacted document. I needed a human source, someone who was on the inside. It took me 2 years, chasing down old employee rosters from defunct DOE contractors, cross-referencing names with retirement records, making quiet, careful phone calls that usually ended with a click and a dial tone. Finally, I found a name. Dr. Aris Thorne, a retired geophysicist who had worked for Sandia National Laboratories in the late 70s and early 80s. His name appeared on a single, unredacted page of a Chimera-related technical paper on subsurface resonance modeling. He was living in a quiet retirement community in Sedona, Arizona. I drove there unannounced, expecting to be told to leave. Instead, I found a frail, elderly man with sharp, intelligent eyes who seemed to have been waiting for someone to knock on his door for 30 years. I didn't even have to finish my introduction. I said the words, McCarran Airport and Project Chimera, and he just nodded slowly, a deep sadness in his expression. He invited me in, and for the next 6 hours, he talked. He was one of the original scientists on Chimera. He confirmed everything I had suspected and filled in the terrifying gaps. The anomaly was a massive, naturally formed crystalline geode, roughly the size of a city bus, located deep beneath the desert. It wasn't inert rock. Its lattice structure under pressure from the tectonic plates had piezoelectric properties on an astronomical scale. It generated a constant, ultra-low frequency field. We didn't discover it, Dr. Thorne said, his voice a dry rasp. It called to us. The first sensitive instruments we deployed in the valley in the 60s for seismic testing went haywire in that area. They gave off readings that were mathematically perfect, too pure to be natural. It was a signal. They drilled, carefully, and they found that the field responded to external stimuli. They could tune it. By introducing specific vibratory patterns or electromagnetic pulses, They could alter the frequency and amplitude of the field it emitted. They thought they had found the holy grail of unconventional warfare. They set up a small underground research lab directly above it. And that's when the biofeedback began. The field, it turned out, was not a one-way street. It resonated with the electrical activity of the human brain. It mirrored and amplified it. If a researcher felt a pang of fear, the field would amplify that fear and broadcast it back, inducing it in others. It created a feedback loop of pure emotion. Panic, aggression, paranoia would ripple through the facility with no discernible cause. "It learns," Thorne whispered, looking at the floor. "The geode. It's like a psychic amplifier. It takes whatever it's given and magnifies it. We were trying to build a weapon, and we ended up creating a localized, non-biological consciousness based on our own worst impulses. The project was immediately classified at the highest level. The decision was made to contain it permanently. They couldn't move it. They couldn't destroy it, for fear of what an uncontrolled energy release would do. So they designed the most robust containment system they could imagine. The obsidian-like damping panels to absorb the primary emissions, the lead and barium concrete to block the radiation, and a massive inert physical weight on top to suppress the geological vibrations. The airport expansion was the perfect cover. "We entombed a ghost," Thorne said. "A ghost we had fed and made strong, and we prayed the tomb would hold." But he told me something else, something that made my blood run cold. The containment was never designed to be perfect. It was designed to suppress the field to acceptable levels. But it had a flaw. It was vulnerable to one specific thing: constant, rhythmic, low-level vibration. The very thing a runway is subjected to, thousands of times a day, every day. Dr. Thorne's revelation recontextualized everything. The constant landings and takeoffs, the very purpose of the structure we had built, were not just pressing down on a secret. They were actively, rhythmically tapping on the lid of a sarcophagus. Each touchdown of a 400-ton aircraft was a tiny hammer blow, sending vibrations through the concrete, through the shielding, and into the containment shell below. It was a slow, methodical process of stress and fatigue. The models predicted the containment would degrade over a century, perhaps longer, Thorne had told me, his hands trembling slightly as he held his cup of tea. But the models were based on air traffic projections from the 1980s. They never anticipated the sheer volume of flights Las Vegas would handle by the 21st century. The vibrational load is an order of magnitude higher than we designed for. The hum I had felt, the one gust the operator had complained about, wasn't just a memory. It was the key. Was it getting stronger? Was the field beginning to leak? I started to look for patterns, not in declassified documents, but in the here and now. I became a connoisseur of local news, a student of public health data, a lurker on community forums for neighborhoods under the flight path of runway 1R19L. I cross-referenced noise complaints, reports of strange health clusters, and social media posts. The picture that emerged was subtle, but deeply unsettling. There was a statistically significant, though small, uptick in reports of vertigo, chronic migraines, and tinnitus in the residential areas directly south of the airport. It was dismissed by health officials as being related to aircraft noise and air pollution, a logical conclusion. But I saw the ghost of Dave's symptoms. On neighborhood forums, I found threads discussing the Vegas hum, a phenomenon many residents experienced. Most wrote it off as city noise, industrial activity, or simply their own ears playing tricks on them. But their descriptions were eerily specific. A low, oppressive pressure. A feeling of unease that was stronger indoors than out. A sense that something was wrong. They were describing the faint but pervasive influence of a 16 Hertz field. I started looking at crime statistics. There was a small but persistent anomaly in a specific zone extending from the southern end of the runway. A higher than average incidence of domestic disputes, road rage incidents, and calls for mental health crises that were coded as public disturbances or erratic behavior. Each incident on its own was meaningless, but taken together, plotted on a map, they created a faint, fan-shaped pattern that radiated outwards from the very spot where we had buried Project Chimera. The psychic amplifier was leaking. The ghost in the machine was whispering through the cracks in its tomb, feeding on the ambient stress and chaos of the city above, and feeding it right back. My quiet academic research had morphed into something immediate and terrifying. This wasn't a historical mystery anymore. It was an ongoing, active public health crisis, and I was one of a handful of people on the planet who knew its true cause. The paranoia that had been a symptom for Dave became a logical reality for me. I started to notice things. A utility van parked on my street for 3 days straight, with no workers in sight. Clicks on my landline phone. My internet speeds would slow to a crawl whenever I searched for keywords related to my investigation. I was no longer just a retired engineer digging into the past. I was a loose end. The people who buried that secret, or at least their successors, were still out there. The silent, faceless bureaucracy that ran Mr. Black would not tolerate this kind of exposure. They had made a man disappear for stealing a rock. What would they do to a man who had pieced together the whole story? I started backing up my files on encrypted drives, hiding them in multiple locations. I changed my routines, never driving the same way home twice. I was living in the shadow of the monster I had helped entomb, and I was beginning to feel its cold breath on my neck. The weight of the secret was becoming unbearable. Dr. Thorne was too old and frail to act, and his knowledge was 30 years out of date. The responsibility fell to me. But what could I do? Go to the press? I could already hear the ridicule. Crazy old man claims there's a psychic ghost under the airport. They'd dismiss me as a conspiracy theorist, and the men in black would ensure I was discredited. Or worse. I needed proof. Hard, physical, undeniable proof. My mind kept returning to Dave's sample. The small, impossibly dense piece of black paneling. The authorities had told his wife he'd been taken for a medical emergency, but they would have cleaned out his office, his car, his life. But they weren't infallible. They were thorough, but they might overlook something personal, something they wouldn't assume had value. They would look for documents, computers. They wouldn't be looking for a rock in a storage unit. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. It took me months of painstaking, cautious searching to track down Dave's wife's family in Ohio. I found her sister, living in a suburb of Cleveland. I wrote her a letter, no phone calls, no emails, explaining who I was, that I was an old trusted friend of Dave's, and that I believed some of his personal effects might hold the key to understanding what really happened to him. I told her I was investigating corporate negligence on the project that might entitle his family to a massive settlement. Money was a language people understood. She was hesitant, suspicious. But the memory of how Dave had been taken, the stonewalling from the government, had left a bitter taste. After several carefully worded exchanges, she agreed to meet. She told me that after Dave was gone, his wife had packed up his workshop and personal belongings and put them into a long-term storage unit in Las Vegas. She had paid the bill for a few years, then stopped. The sister wasn't even sure if the contents were still there or had been auctioned off. She gave me the name of the facility and the unit number. I flew to Cleveland, picked up the key and the paperwork she had kept, and flew back to Vegas, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. The storage facility was a sprawling, sun-bleached place in an industrial part of town. The air was thick with dust and the smell of hot metal. I found the unit, the roll-up door stiff and groaning with rust. It hadn't been opened in nearly 2 decades. Inside, the air was stale and dead. It was a tomb of a forgotten life. Dusty boxes, old power tools, stacks of engineering journals. I spent hours sifting through everything, my hope dwindling with each empty box. And then I found it. Tucked away inside an old army surplus ammunition can, beneath a pile of greasy rags, was a small, heavy, lead-lined pouch. I recognized it instantly. My hands shook as I opened it. There it was. The sample. A shard of perfect, light-devouring black. Holding it, even through the pouch, I felt that familiar, sickening thrum. It felt awake. But there was more. Taped to the inside lid of the ammo can was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was Dave's. The first few pages were his neat, precise engineering notes. But as I turned the pages, the writing became a frantic, chaotic scrawl. It was his descent into madness, chronicled in his own hand. There were sketches of the containment structure, frantic calculations about frequency propagation, and paranoid ramblings about the listeners and the sound that unwrites. But amidst the chaos was the data, hard numbers, spectrometer readings of the sample's composition, recordings of the 16 Hertz sine wave, detailed notes on the field's effect on his own cognitive functions. He had documented his own destruction. It was horrifying, tragic, and it was the smoking gun. I had the physical evidence. I had the first-hand testimony of the man it destroyed. The ghost in the machine now had a voice. I had the sample and the notebook, a physical piece of the tomb and a testament from its first victim. But I was an engineer, not a material scientist or a neurologist. To be credible, I needed independent verification from someone the world would listen to, someone with credentials that couldn't be easily dismissed. I couldn't just walk into any university lab. The moment the material was analyzed, it would trip alarms within the scientific and intelligence communities. I needed someone brilliant, discreet, and brave. I thought back to my career, to the consultants and experts I had worked with. One name stood out: Dr. Evelyn Reid. She was a professor of physics and material science at Berkeley, a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient known for her work in exotic matter and quantum mechanics. I had consulted with her once on a project involving vibration damping in a suspension bridge. She had a reputation for being fiercely independent and disdainful of government bureaucracy. She was also notoriously curious. I reached out to her through a trusted intermediary, a former colleague who now sat on the university's board. I didn't give details, only that I had a unique material sample related to a matter of extreme public safety and that it required absolute discretion. Intrigued, she agreed to a meeting. I flew to Berkeley and met her not in her lab, but in a quiet corner of the botanical garden on campus. I laid out the story, starting with the pit and ending with the notebook in my hands. I expected skepticism, even pity. Instead, she listened with an unnerving, focused intensity, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she was silent for a full minute. "Most people who come to me with stories like this are unwell," she said, her voice calm and analytical. "But you're an engineer. You've brought data, not just belief. Let me see the sample." Back in her private lab late that night, we opened the lead pouch. Under the controlled lights of the lab, the sample seemed even darker, a small patch of absolute nothing. Dr. Reid handled it with specialized tongs, placing it in a vacuum chamber for the initial analysis. She started with a non-invasive Raman spectroscopy. The results that came back on her screen made her lean in closer, her brow furrowed. "This is impossible," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "The molecular bonds, they're not covalent or ionic. It's something else. The lattice structure is paradoxical. It appears to be a synthetic, crystalline metamaterial designed to function as a perfect energy sink. Specifically, for mechanical and electromagnetic waves in the extremely low frequency range." She was confirming Dave's frantic theories in precise scientific language. She then turned her attention to his notebook, cross-referencing his field data with her own initial readings. She saw the 16 Hz signature he'd recorded. "If this data is accurate," she said, her professional calm giving way to a visible disquiet, "and this material is part of a containment system, then the vibrational load from constant air traffic could indeed induce microfractures over time. It's designed to absorb energy, but nothing is perfect. A system like this would inevitably leak. It would bleed energy." The next day, she ran a simulation based on the material's properties, Dave's data, and the known air traffic volume at Harry Reid International. The conclusion was chilling. Her model showed that the containment field had likely degraded by at least 12% since its construction. The 16 Hz field was almost certainly propagating beyond the airport perimeter, at a low but measurable amplitude. The ghost was not only whispering, it was slowly raising its voice. We had the proof. We had the science. We were on the verge of exposing it all. And then they came for us. I had been staying in a nearby hotel. I got a panicked call from Dr. Reid at 2 a.m. They know. Someone knows. The lab's alarms were tripped. A silent trip directly to campus security. But I have my own system. They bypassed the main door, disabled the cameras. They were professionals. Frank, they're here. I told her to get out, to leave everything. The line went dead. I threw my few belongings in a bag and ran. I never saw Dr. Reid again. I later read a small news brief that she had taken an unexpected and immediate sabbatical for personal health reasons and was traveling abroad, unreachable. Her lab was sealed. When I finally got a trusted contact to check on it, he told me it had been completely sanitized. The equipment was wiped, the servers replaced. And the sample, of course, was gone. They had taken everything. They took the sample. They took the scientist. They silenced the only person with the public credibility to validate my story. All I had left were my memories, my notes, and the digital copies of Dave's notebook I had obsessively backed up. My original plan, a press conference with a respected scientist and undeniable physical evidence, was shattered. I was back to being a single, aging man with a crazy story. But now, I was a hunted man. I knew their methods. They wouldn't just discredit me. They would erase me just like they erased Dave. I abandoned my house in Henderson. my car, my entire life. I became a ghost, moving from one anonymous motel to the next, paying in cash, using burner phones. My paranoia now a necessary survival tool. For months, I lived in the shadows, trying to figure out my next move. The mainstream media was a dead end. Any major news organization I approached would either dismiss the story or, more likely, have their legal department kill it after a single phone call from a 3-letter agency. I would be exposed, and the story would be buried forever. The system that created Chimera was designed to protect itself. So I chose another path, the one you are reading now. I realized I couldn't win a direct fight. They had all the power, all the resources. But the world had changed since the 1990s. There was a new domain, a new battleground where information could, if properly deployed, become a weapon in its own right. The internet. I couldn't hold a press conference, but I could write. I could put down every last detail, every specification, every conversation, every piece of data. I could construct the story so completely, so realistically, that it would have its own ring of truth. I could bypass the gatekeepers and deliver the message directly to the public. This account is my last resort. It is my data dump, my message in a bottle thrown into the vast, chaotic ocean of the digital world. I have disseminated this text, broken into these 9 parts, through multiple encrypted channels, released simultaneously on dozens of forums, blogs, and social media platforms, through automated systems I have spent months preparing. By the time you are reading this, I am likely already gone, either in the wind or in their custody. It no longer matters. What matters is that the story survives. What matters is that the data is out there. To the engineers who read this, look at the original 1990s expansion plans for McCarran. Look for the last-minute addendums for Runway 1R and 19L. Look for the discrepancies in the concrete orders, the sanitized soil removal manifests. The evidence is there, buried in the bureaucracy. To the scientists, look for a persistent 16 Hz ELF wave signature in the Las Vegas Valley. The signal is weak, but it should be detectable with the right equipment. Cross-reference it with public health data. Look for the patterns. They are there. To everyone else who lives in or flies into Las Vegas, the next time you land, as the wheels touch down on that smooth gray concrete, pay attention. Feel that vibration. Is it just the plane? Or is it an echo from the tomb beneath your feet? The hum you dismiss as tinnitus, the strange feeling of unease you can't quite place, the irrational anger that flares up in traffic on the I-215. Is it just the stress of modern life in a city of excess? Or is it the whisper of a buried ghost, an entity slowly being awakened by the very city it lies beneath? They buried Project Chimera under the assumption that concrete and steel could contain anything. But they failed to understand that some things cannot be contained. They only fester, waiting. I have told you what they sealed under the runway.